Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the ResearchWorks podcast. And hello, Marissa. Thank you for joining us again today.
Thanks for having me.
Always lovely to have you. And today I'm very excited because we're headed over to Florida, virtually speaking, to speak with our guest today, Professor Susan Nittrouer. Welcome, Susan. And did I say your name properly?
Oh, you said it absolutely wonderfully, and I'm so excited to be here. Thank you.
Oh, it's so lovely to have you here today. Thank you so much for giving up some of your evening to speak with us. We're very much looking forward to our conversation today because your article was published very recently, 2024, very much hot off the press. And so for our listeners, the article is titled Early Otitis Media Puts Children at Risk for Later Auditory and Language Deficits, published in the International Journal of Pediatrics. Now, give me a moment. No. Can you do it for me, Susan?
Pediatric otorhinolaryngology, ear, nose, and throat.
I love that. Thank you.
So good. Now, I'm very excited to talk through this article today because it's a topic of ear infections, which we hear about a lot, but do I actually know much about it and what the impact it can have? No. So this is where we're going to dive into today. But firstly, I want to tell our listeners a bit more about you, Susan. So Susan comes with a great deal of experience. She's currently a professor in the Department of Speech, Language and Hearing Sciences at the University of Florida and heads the Speech Development Laboratory. Her research focuses on questions regarding how children learn language and what goes wrong when they encounter challenges. Today we'll be talking about one of her big interest areas, ear infections, and its relationship with children's language development.
Oh, it's very good. It's very exciting and love everything that you do, Susan. It's been wonderful to read your work.
Well, thank you.
But as usual, before we dive into the world of ear infections and the big part that it has on language development, we're going to do our icebreaker question, which of course has nothing to do with what we're actually going to discuss today. So, Susan, what is the strangest or perhaps unexpected food combination you have ever had?
Oh, the most unusual food combination. I would probably have to say green eggs and ham. Who would have thought that these two foods would go together?
Right.
But I discovered it quite by accident one morning when I got up. I've always been a red egg and ham type person, but I got up one morning. I had no red eggs. I had no blue eggs. I had no pink eggs. I only had green eggs. So knowing that Sam I Am had found this combination to be satisfying, I thought I would try it myself and found it quite delightful.
I love that. That was brilliant.
That's fantastic.
I can't top that at all.
No, either can I.
Mine
Mine sounds quite... what is yours, Dana?
Well, at first I was going to say something like, waffles with fried chicken and maple syrup. Just seems odd but delicious, but not great. You don't feel great afterwards.
Yeah.
And then I saw something on Instagram, good old Instagram, which my husband greatly contests and thinks that it's not a great combination. But it's like vanilla ice cream with olive oil. I know.
No.
And like a pinch of salt. And it was actually really good.
You did it.
I did it. I was curious and I thought, well, I'm just going to try something because everyone tries something that they see online. And this was surprisingly good. And I know I'm a foodie and it makes me sound really silly now, but I did actually think it was quite good. It was unusual. It was a good quality olive oil though. It wasn't just it was a good quality olive oil that I used for my salad dressings and it was good. So I would encourage you to try it before,
Okay,
dish it.
I might. Mine is also to do with ice cream, but it's from when I was a child, and I remember being at a birthday party, and I think I must have been about 10, and of course, whenever I was dared, I'd be like, yeah, sure. And the dare was to eat the ice cream cake with a big thing of tomato sauce on top, and then I had to finish the bowl, and so I ate this bowl of ice cream with tomato sauce, and the joke is continued that whenever there's ice cream, I have never done it again, and I never will, but that was probably one of the worst food combinations I experienced, never to be repeated.
Yeah, that's not a good one for sure. I can see why you might be a bit scarred adding something else to your ice cream.
It makes olive oil and ice cream sound less intimidating.
No, it does. Yeah. And for all the Americans, tomato sauce is ketchup, and we call it tomato sauce here. Yes. All right, now that has nothing to do, well, no, it doesn't have anything to do with what we're talking about today. That was a good try. But let's talk about actually what we're going to talk about today. So otitis media is a common disorder of early childhood, but its impact on auditory and language development has been unclear, with contradictory results having been reported in the past. This study investigates the impact of early otitis media on auditory and language development in children aged 5 to 10 years, some with a significant history of otitis media and others without. The study aimed to explore how otitis media affects temporal modulation detection, vocabulary and phonological sensitivity. The findings indicate that children with a history of otitis media had poorer performance in auditory and language measures, particularly in phonological sensitivity. And this suggests that early otitis media impacts both auditory and language development, with the potential to impact long-term language acquisition mechanisms.
I have so many questions about this, and as usual, we're going to start kind of with the background and at the basics. So we often hear about children having ear infections, and we obviously, that's probably the extent of what we know. So can you break it down a bit more for us and tell us what otitis media is?
Yes, absolutely. So otitis media is certainly the most common disorder of early childhood. Before school age, 80% of all children will have had at least one episode of otitis media. And basically, it's an infection of the middle ear cavity. So there's inflammation and some fluid buildup, fluid colloquially known as pus.
Okay.
And of course, as parents know it, it's the reason that we lose sleep at night, because a child with otitis media is often in quite a bit of pain. And the reason that it happens is largely anatomical, because there is going from the middle ear cavity is behind the eardrum, behind the tympanic membrane. And there's a tube going from the middle ear cavity down to the back of the throat. And that opens for us repeatedly, many times, an hour, a minute, to allow air to go into the middle ear cavity, because the air pressure in the middle ear has to be the same as the air pressure in the environment, so that the eardrum can vibrate maximally. If the eardrum is retracted or extended in one direction or the other, it can't move as freely. Anyone who's been on an airplane that descends rapidly or ascends rapidly knows that feeling of temporarily having a retracted eardrum.
Yes.
So with children, that eustachian tube is more horizontal. It's also shorter, which means that bacteria, viruses can travel quite easily from the back of the throat into the middle ear cavity, setting up an infection there. And although many children get them, the problem is when they are extensive. Children can get these ear infections, and even if their doctor prescribes antibiotics that ends the infection, the bacterial infection, fluid can remain there, largely because that little eustachian tube in children is so horizontal. It's harder for the fluid to leave. So that sets up, having fluid in the middle ear cavity means that that whole structure in the middle ear does not function as well as it should. So the child ends up with a mild hearing loss. And that's what we're concerned about.
Wow. And my next question is, when you said it happening early in age, how early can children obviously get diagnosed with ear infections? And is there a certain time point that we're more concerned about? Like when they're younger, they're more at risk of I guess, like longer term damage from ear infections?
Well, that's certainly what we're looking at. Certainly when children are younger, they're at more risk of these infections. And in fact, children can be born with middle ear infections. In fact, there's some evidence, although it's hard to get, that children who are born prematurely have more actual infections of the middle ear cavity. And we're very worried about it at that time, because what research over the past 30 years or so has demonstrated is just how much development of the central auditory pathways happens after birth.
Right.
And that development depends on the child getting the appropriate amounts and kinds of auditory input at those very tender young ages.
Wow. And so you mentioned with some of these children who, premature babies, are there any other risk categories, or like all children? I mean, I gather the horizontal nature of that tube is probably a big contributing factor, but are there children who are more susceptible to ear infections compared to others? Do we know that?
Well, there are certainly some environmental factors that put children at risk for ear infections. Some of the work having been done in Australia there. So environmental factors, certainly secondhand smoke, certain allergens. While pets are lovely, it has been shown that children living with pets tend to have more ear infections. Certain different kinds of heating and cooling systems, being in daycare, just because children are in environments where there are more bacteria floating around in those little daycares. So there are all some factors that can put children at risk.
Wow. Yeah.
And in terms of treating ear infections, you mentioned obviously there's antibiotics. Is there any other treatments, particularly if children are having recurrent ear infections, or is there other, can it be a matter of sometimes not having antibiotics and do people wait it out, or what are some different treatment options as well?
Well, of course, we always worry about over-treating any infection with antibiotics. Not so much for the individual, but for society as a whole, because then the bacteria can become drug resistant. A common treatment that works quite effectively is that the otolaryngologist, the pediatric otolaryngologist, will put a small tube, a ventilation tube, in the tympanic membrane. It's quite small, but it allows that middle ear cavity now to get air appropriately.
Wow.
And I'm hearing of that happening more and more for children with recurrent ear infections. And obviously that then helps with a hearing loss component as well. Is that right?
Yes, that's absolutely right. Because when the otolaryngologist places that tube, she can also suction out whatever fluid is in there. And so having that nice aerated cavity there helps to prevent recurrent otitis media.
Wow.
And does that canal, you know how you meant obviously it's horizontal and it's small, is there an age where that starts to grow to a size where, or position where ear infections reduce from an anatomical position? Like is it after 3 or 4 years or a certain age where we notice a big drop off in the recurrence of ear infections?
Well, it's gradual. It begins as children are growing all across childhood into adulthood. Gradually, that eustachian tube is becoming longer and more vertical.
Okay.
And now, we've touched on this, but why is it so important to identify and treat?
To identify these
and get on to treating ear infections. And this, I guess, will lead us into your article as well.
Well, first of all, I should say that not treating it in developed countries such as the United States and Australia, there is little risk of serious morbidity. But in developing countries where children are not treated, middle ear infections can lead to quite dire consequences. Sensorineural hearing loss. In some cases, even the infection can get into the brain itself and can, in the worst cases, lead to death.
Wow.
So you do want to be treating it.
Yeah.
We are used to this condition being treated effectively.
Yeah.
And for us, we want to see it treated because, again, we're recognizing more clearly how important having that period early in life of appropriate auditory input is to the development of the central auditory pathways. So auditory functions such as those that we investigated in this paper, as well as language development.
Yeah. Now that's all very, very interesting, and we'd love to dive into your article now. Thank you for that background.
thanks,
I feel like I
Susan.
learned a lot in
Me
that
too.
short period of time. So in your article, you do first describe a preliminary study, which I think is worth talking about because that really does set the scene for the assessments. And you talked about the modulation rates and how you tested it out to find out what that would look like for your actual testing. Can you talk us through what that actually means in terms of the modulation rates and how we can use that how you use that for your assessments?
Yes, I think it's probably worth discussing what our auditory measure was.
Yes.
As I said, it was a supra auditory measure that we were interested in. In other words, we were not specifically looking at whether these children had hearing loss in the sense of raised auditory thresholds.
Right.
In other words, at the time of testing, their ability to detect a sound was as good as any other child without a history of ear infections.
Sure.
So temporal modulation refers to the change in amplitude over time of a sound. So I'm going to give a very simple demonstration myself. I perhaps should have put one, a recording, but a standard, we used a 3-interval forced choice, so the child would hear 3 sounds, and one of them had modulation and the other 2 didn't. And the choice was, which of these sounds has modulation? So one without modulation sounded something like this. Okay. Ones with modulation sounded something like this.
Okay. Right.
And so that modulation could be fairly slow, or it could be quite rapid. In fact, more rapid than I can actually make it.
Right. Okay.
And so there are 2 reasons why we wanted to look at slower rates of modulation and more rapid rates. In the auditory dimension, it's thought that different phenomena, different mechanisms in the auditory system account for being able to detect modulation at slow rates versus fast rates.
Okay.
So at fast rates, it's really a very peripheral effect, and it's temporal resolution. So just how clearly can you hear the sound? At slower rates, it's more of a pattern recognition because you have to hear across a fairly long sample of the signal. So again, it's a more central property. We know that in typically developing children or children without auditory problems, including those related to otitis media, the ability to recognize modulation at rapid rates develops relatively sooner than at slower rates. So we were interested in both of those sorts of phenomena. When it comes to speech, because we are interested in how these auditory functions support language development, fast and slow rates of modulation support different aspects of language development itself. So the rapid rates, if we can make them really rapid, that is very much in speech like the vibrations of the larynx. So the voice, generation of voice itself, and being able to recognize that structure has certain functions, such as helping us to be able to recognize speech in noisy backgrounds.
Right.
But
okay.
at slower rates, it helps us recognize the individual speech sounds as we open and close our mouths, quite literally.
Yes.
Yeah.
The more closed our mouths are, the softer the sound is. As we open our mouth, the sound gets more intense or higher amplitude. So we're constantly opening and closing our mouths to different extents. So there is this pattern of temporal change in the speech signal. Being able to recognize that, in other words, being able to recognize places where there's a change in amplitude
Yes.
in the signal that may not be very deep
Yes.
in amplitude change. If you can do that, then you're going to be able to recognize speech better. And for the child's going to be able to develop speech more effectively.
Wow. That is really
It's
interesting.
really interesting, and it makes sense why these children that do have these difficulties are, then obviously lead to issues with language development.
Really interesting.
So now jumping into your study, can you tell us a bit more about who was involved in your study?
The children?
Yeah.
So, okay. So we often, because I've worked on this topic in the past. 30 years ago, I had a study where I looked at speech development, mostly speech perception in children who had histories of otitis media. Because of that, quite honestly, for a number of years, I've been excluding children who have these histories. But more recently, I decided to revisit that idea and look at whether or not children with histories of otitis media had this sequence, if I could connect the dots between problems with the suprathreshold auditory functions, in this case, temporal modulation, and with language development. And as you know, I was interested in two kinds of language structure. So in this case, for the most part, we had children who had very little history of otitis media, which we defined as children who had fewer than 3 episodes of otitis media before the age of 3 years. And we selected pretty much for children who had positive histories, meaning that their parents reported more than 6 episodes of otitis media.
Wow.
Now, that's probably important to a purist listening to your podcast, because they're going to rise up and say, well, wait a minute, I don't really have a good accounting of how many discrete episodes of otitis media these children had, or how long they lasted, or how much hearing loss they had during that time. And that's absolutely true. We used a coarse measure of histories of otitis media, but we believe that just emphasizes and makes all the more significant the fact that we found a difference between these children.
Yeah, absolutely. And he did involve actually a lot of children. When I look at your paper, 117 children participated. So it's no small study. And so that does describe the breadth of this kind of research. Can we get into now the measures? You spoke about, obviously we've covered the temporal modulation detection, and now you have the 2 vocabulary, or the language measures. Can you just talk us through in brief what they were?
Absolutely. Let me circle back, though, to the measure of temporal modulation and just emphasize that the question was, how deep did the modulation have to be in order for the child to recognize it?
Right,
that was the
that's
question.
Important. Yeah, yep.
And so a very specific hypothesis here was that one's ability to recognize that modulation, specifically recognize it at depths that are not so very deep, would specifically support the child's ability to recognize, I'm going to say individual speech sounds.
Okay.
In the world of speech science, they're known as phonemes.
Okay.
So the individual sounds of a language. Okay. And being able to do that depends on having access to the details of the acoustic speech signal. So we had phonological awareness measures, and for the most part, in this case, the child heard a target word and then heard 3 words, and in one case had to say which of the 3 words began with the same sound, and in another case had to say which of the 3 words ended in the same sound.
Right.
And now we divided our children, they were between 5 and 10, and we divided them into a younger group and an older group. The ability to recognize that kind of structure, that is what sound a word begins with or ends with, is very developmental, meaning that different skills come in at different ages.
Of course, yeah.
And initially, children learn to recognize what words sound like at the beginning, or attend to that information, what words sound like at the beginning of the word, sooner than they learn to really tune into and recognize exactly what sounds are at the ends of words.
Yes.
So that's why, for that measure, for the younger children, it was more appropriate to use the task where we were looking at, can they recognize what words sound like at the beginning? And for the older children, use the measure of what words sound like at the end of the word.
Interesting. Yeah.
So we had that task, and that was really our more sophisticated language measure. Our other language measure was one of vocabulary. And just how many words do children have?
Right.
Now that's important, because if you walk down the hall or go ask your neighborhood speech pathologist, they're going to tell you that words are composed of individual speech sounds, of these phonemes.
Yep.
Certainly that's true to those of us who are mature language users, but it's not necessarily the case. Children begin to recognize holistic word patterns. And only as they get older, learn to drill down and find the bits that comprise those words.
Right.
So a child, in fact, an adult, can have a fairly significant functional lexicon, that is vocabulary, set of words that they use, without ever being aware of the details of those words.
Yeah.
So we used those 2 language measures, and an overriding hypothesis was that this ability to recognize temporal structure in the acoustic signal, the auditory measure, would affect the development of the phonological skill, that is being able to recognize the individual sounds of the words, and support that skill more thoroughly than being able to develop a vocabulary.
Well, that's probably
And
the
indeed,
perfect
that's what we
time
found.
to find. Yeah, exactly. That was perfect.
And now that brings me to my next point, because
Yeah.
obviously you had this hypothesis and you went through this. What was the most significant findings of your study, particularly regarding the impact of, like we talked about, that early otitis media on children's, we talked about the temporal modulation detection and then the impact on their vocab and phonological sensitivity?
Well, I think that really what this demonstrates from a high level is that having a period of not optimal auditory input can put a child at risk for auditory deficits, and that in turn can put the child at risk for a specific kind of language deficit. That in particular, most strongly this phonological deficit, although there was a difference between these 2 groups in their vocabularies. So in terms of practical significance, what all this means is that we should be concerned about otitis media in children, as well as other conditions that can put children at risk for delayed development of the central auditory pathways.
Yeah.
We should take these matters quite seriously, provide early intervention of the right kind, and continue to monitor them and recognize the problems in school age that will arise from these early conditions, these early deficits, and be aware of them and treat them appropriately.
And does this mean then, so when children are getting ear infections, that, you know, they should be referred on to, I guess here they're called an ENT, when you met the what is it known as?
Otolaryngology.
Otolaryngology. Usually we say otolaryngologist. Usually the rhino part isn't in there.
That's
So
right.
a
That's what I wasn't sure.
pediatric-
Yeah. So is
A pediatric otolaryngologist.
Yeah.
So is that
Yes.
part of what you've kind of, because obviously you've looked at the impact on otitis media on children's, I guess, vocab and their speech development, is part of then the treatment that early, in terms of early detection, referring on then to the pediatric specialist?
Yes, absolutely. They should be referred on to the pediatric specialist, and they should also be referred to a speech language pathologist. They should be getting hearing tests, be referred to an audiologist to see if this is affecting their hearing, even if just temporarily.
Yes. I mean, it's so critical, really, isn't it? And that hypothesis, and supporting that hypothesis with regards to the auditory input and that relationship with language and verbal, I feel like that is very significant finding, isn't it? And there's a lot of practical implications for that. You mentioned in the paper there's often some contradictions in the literature about of the role of otitis media potentially on language development. Can you talk us through that a little bit and how your results sort of sit amongst some of those discussions?
Yes, absolutely. For me, this is the most revealing part of the study that leads to a lot of other research. I have for a long time been quite interested in a model of language structure, really, known as duality of patterning, meaning that human language has two very distinct levels of structure, as I sort of alluded to. One is real words and how we combine those words, so syntactic structure. And then, as I said, we tend to think that the individual speech sounds are just part and parcel of that, and that words are comprised of these individual speech sounds. But in fact, this level of structure, phonological structure, meaning the independent, meaningless sounds of language, that is quite a distinct level of structure. And what we have found in other work is that these two levels, that is real words and how we put them together, and phonological units, those two levels of language structure develop largely independently.
Right.
And so the extent of the independence is not often recognized. So one thing that likely explains the contradiction in results in past work here is not too much attention to what the dependent language measure was. Was it vocabulary or was it more phonological?
Yes.
And that's significant.
Yes.
Something else that I think is really, really important here is that this study showed that otitis media is a risk factor. That is, if a child has lots of episodes of otitis media, that is not the, let me say, death knell for language development. It means the child is at risk There can be mediating factors depending on the child's language environment in particular, depending on how quickly the child can get past that temporary auditory deficit. So there can be great differences, and we need to be considering these other mediating factors, these protective factors, in considering how otitis media might affect language development.
Wow. And what can we do, like in terms of people who are in the world of these young children at the time, so parents, potentially therapists, educators, daycare, what can we be doing to support these children, given its incidence and its occurrence and its significant impact it has in their language?
So let me back up. There is one point that we have not yet covered as well as we probably should. And that is the dual roots model that was uncovered here. 30 years ago when I did this work, we saw otitis media merely as a sort of, may I say, veil to language experience. That is, that if a child had some time with a temporary hearing loss, they just could not hear the language around them that well. So it was really modeled as a deficit in language experience. Okay. Where our thinking has come, at least for me, is that we need to see this period of time of a deficit in auditory input as a risk to the development of these central auditory pathways that we now recognize develop to such a strong extent postnatally. So what this study also, to a nice extent, I think, showed is that this development of vocabulary is dependent on that language experience. So that's one root of effect. The development of phonological structure was found to be strongly related to this auditory function that was affected. So there's a dual root model. So when we talk about what can we do for children at risk for otitis media and subsequent language, auditory and language deficits, first of all, we want to minimize the number and duration of episodes of otitis media. So that means monitoring these children quite well. But if a child is having frequent otitis media, we want to treat it as best we can, get rid of the fluid as quickly as possible. And many of the things we might do are, as usual in these cases, factors that work for all children. So, for example, making sure that the auditory world of the child is optimal. So in the home, turning the TV off when we're talking to the child, not having background noise, having time when the child is getting a good, optimal auditory input to begin with. And of course, so that helps with the development of the auditory pathways. And then in terms of language, talking with the child appropriately when it comes to language development in general. For example, one thing we know is that even though we're talking about auditory input here, children learn language just as much by generating language as by hearing it. So when we talk with children or read books with them, there needs to be a two-way conversation that we want to maintain. And then if a child has a history of otitis media, as the child enters school, educators and speech language pathologists within the academic setting want to be following that child and specifically looking for problems that can arise from these phonological deficits, including literacy problems, dyslexia.
And it's interesting because, like everything you said, if we can get onto it earlier as well, and then that impact, like you said, as they go up, and you think of what a child's demands might be from an educational perspective when they're young, learning sounds and getting ready to sound, to learn to read and then to write. And, you know, if we can really, I guess, identify that these children are at risk earlier, then the impact that has on the long term is huge. So there's so much to draw from.
And the dual aspect of it as well, to be able to really, you know, purposefully think about the auditory input as well as the language and what children are immersed in. It's that intentionality behind it. And I love that you've raised that as well. Gosh, that was good.
So my question is, Susan, where to from here? Are there unanswered questions or potential areas for future research that you now want to go into based on this study?
Absolutely. And I'm very excited to tell you and share that I just received a new research grant from the National Institutes of Health to go exactly where I would like to go, partly based on this work. So as I mentioned, there are other conditions that put a child at risk for delayed development of these central auditory pathways, one being premature birth. So I want to examine those other factors as well.
Amazing.
And then I'm very interested in this question of protective factors. And we know that poverty, a child's socioeconomic status, in great part accounts for how well protected a child is against the deleterious consequences of these conditions. So certainly middle-class children can be born prematurely or have lots of ear infections. And much of our research heretofore, including my own, has looked at the effects of, say, otitis media on middle-class children with histories of otitis media versus middle-class children without those histories. So now what I want to do is overlay on that kind of question differences in socioeconomic status and look at what happens when a child does not have those protective factors.
Wow. Gosh, that's some really important work coming up. Congratulations on that grant. There would have been a lot of work that went into that, but what's going to follow from that, we'll be following closely as well. So thank you for going through all of that in such great detail for us. There's some great take-homes there. But we're not done just yet. Of course, we're going to head to the most popular segment, as everyone always keeps telling us, and that's Tell It to Ed. Ed is our producer. He doesn't have a background in child health, but he has been listening on this conversation, and I'm pretty sure he's quite curious about a few things here. I could see him taking some notes down in the corner of my eye there. So before he gets into his question though, Susan, I'll get you to summarise your area of research that we spoke about today in about 60 seconds or so, and Ed will have time for a question. Take it away, Susan.
Okay. Well, I am very interested in language development, and in particular in how auditory functioning supports language development. So over the course of my career, I've looked at children with hearing loss, deaf children, and their development of spoken language. And that has led me into studying other sorts of language functions, what I call suprathreshold auditory functions. And what we've learned is that even a temporary period of hearing loss early in life has negative consequences for the development of central auditory pathways and these suprathreshold complex auditory functions that underlie language development so strongly.
That was brilliant.
Yeah, well done.
I was captivated for that minute. That was great, Susan. Thank you. All right, Ed, over to you.
Thank you. I'm very appreciative for that 60 seconds because I think there was so many words with so many syllables in it for an IT guy. There's no acronyms, there's no short words for me to grab a hold of. But it's been a fascinating insight. And I'm not sure what else I could add to the conversation, but I guess, and I throw really kind of crazy things out there because I don't understand. But From the perspective of language development, and you said like even small temporary losses of hearing can have major impacts. I'm curious about children who, or even young adults, I guess, who can speak more than one language, and whether elements of speaking things in different ways, like I guess phonetics, has any kind of impact on language development, and whether that improves things or makes it more difficult, or sorry, it's a little left field, but that's possibly what I can add to the conversation.
Good question, because a lot of children at that age are bilingual. That's the time. Susan, what do you have to say about that?
So I believe the question is, what's the effect of bilingual language environments on language development in general? That is certainly something that many people have been studying, Ed. And the jury is still out a bit. I will say that I don't know. Australia might be one of the only other countries in the world, other than the United States, where I often wonder, is this a question for the rest of the world? Because as we know, so much of the world is by nature bilingual.
Yes.
And what I can tell you is that whether a child is learning one language or two languages, the child comes into the world ready to learn any language. And then each language has its own set of auditory properties that serve to define the speech sounds of that language. So learning a language as a child means not just learning about the acoustic detail that support the sounds of your language, but learning to ignore the acoustic detail that does not support your language. So learning to ignore acoustic detail for other languages. If a child is learning two languages now, of course, the child is learning two sets of acoustic cues that the child should be aware of. So surely that makes the child more facile in their language development. When it comes to vocabulary, however, what we know is that development is still similar. So, for example, with vocabulary, children rarely are experiencing both languages at exactly the same times in the same microenvironments. So they might be learning the vocabulary of home, plate, spoon, cup, bedtime, bath, so forth, in one language, and learning the vocabulary of something else, of school, the zoo, their religious home, in a different language. So often, at least in the early years, that level of language structure, that is vocabulary, can be more bifurcated rather than redundant.
Wow. That's interesting.
So I hope that helps.
No, that was great.
He's quite a sound guy. I was actually surprised he didn't ask, because I did have a question that I was hoping that you might ask, Ed, and which I might just quickly ask you, Susan, with regards to volume and auditory inputs. So after a child has, a temporary reduction in what they're hearing in their world, and we're wanting to really address things from an auditory perspective, do we need to be conscious of what volumes, like, if the children are listening to music or wanting to put headphones on because people have devices now, do we need to be thoughtful about the volume that they're listening to things in?
The short answer is no, as long as it's sufficient for the child to recognize.
Okay.
If a child is never going to be able to hear sound at a higher level than what anybody else hears.
Yes.
Okay. When a child has a hearing loss, it's the soft sounds that the child cannot hear.
Yeah, sure.
It's not the case that the loudest sound that they can hear is higher in amplitude than anybody else. There's the upper limit of how high the amplitude, how loud a sound can be for us, is the same for everyone, regardless of whether they have a hearing loss or not. The difference is only with the soft sounds.
Yeah. Really interesting. Gosh, that was fascinating, Marissa.
I could ask more questions, but but that has been insightful, and we'll save it to when we chat with you again someday, Susan.
We will.
Thank you so much. I
amazing.
think it's a topic that is so important, and if we can, this early detection and getting onto realizing the impact that it can have,
absolutely,
in terms of long-term language development, and like you said, then onto literacy and things like that is huge.
Absolutely incredible.
Congratulations on your new grant, and all the best for your future research.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for this opportunity to talk with all of you over there in Australia. I very much appreciate it.
We loved it. Thank you for staying up late for us as well. And to all our listeners, we'll put links to this paper on our website, researchworks.net. So please head over there to find out more. And if you want to keep this as part of a record of your CPD requirements, there's a form there you can fill out as well as part of your PD record. But for now, we'll say goodbye, and we'll talk to you all again next time. Bye.
Bye.